Thanks so much for welcoming me this morning. You know, you're all dear to me, and this is one of my very favorite places to worship or to teach, to preach. Your pastor is one of my favorite people in the wide world. Many of the rest of my favorite people are sitting in the pew, so I'm super glad to be here this morning. I'm supposed to be behind the pulpit, but it just feels so good to be around people that I'm going to stand down here if it's okay with you. All right, let me adjust my setup here. So I don't know what you all have been up to, but my 2 words for what I've been up to could be summarized like this: not much. We have been hunkered down in our house since March the 15th. And we did that because we wanted to be safe. We wanted to help other people be safe. I've been out to the grocery a few times here recently. Thank goodness our pool opened a couple weeks ago, and I've been able to have my 5-year-old outside of the house. Right? You all thought COVID was hard on you, but I have a 5-year-old in the house. So our days consist of, building forts and cleaning food off the couch, of putting toys away for the 13th time, of dodging Nerf bullets coming past your head, of a child trying to climb the literal walls. And so we're very grateful for being able to get outside and recover a bit. What a time this is to be alive. What a time this is to take in the events of history. Kevin and I were speaking the other night, and he said, for centuries, people will be speaking about this time and how we lived through it. I mean, think for just a moment. We were introduced sometime in early March to the idea of COVID-19. And there was all this back and forth of whether or not we should take it seriously. And then people started falling ill. And at first we weren't supposed to wear the masks. And then there weren't enough masks. And now you have to wear your mask, right? Yeah. There was scarcity. Do you remember? I was driving home from a conference I was at in North Carolina when everything sort of shut down, right? I knew when the NBA shut down and when March Madness was off, I better get home to Indiana. And so everything shut down. So I remember driving home, and we would stop in every town at the Target and try to get toilet paper and paper towels and hand sanitizer. And there was none to be found. What a time to be alive when you cannot buy toilet tissue. And then there was not enough PPE. The doctors and nurses fighting this disease, and people were hospitalized, and they didn't have what they needed to protect themselves. They didn't have what they needed to protect those people who were serving on the front lines. Since then, we've had unbelievable numbers of deaths, people we loved who've been taken by the disease. We've had in the news senseless murders. We've had protests and race riots. We've had troops marching in the streets. Now we wear our face masks everywhere we go. I'm told in the southeast that the cicadas are on the way, larger than they've been in centuries. If you're not aware, the dust storm reached Indiana this week. And someone else reminded me that the killer hornets are on the way. And I hope you do. It doesn't take a brilliant scholar to look around and feel like you're living in the middle of Exodus, right? It doesn't take a scholar or a genius to look around and say, God must be speaking in the midst of this. Now, don't mistake me. I'm not talking about calling all these things some sort of punishment or wrath. What I'm saying is we cannot miss the import of this moment. We cannot fail to recognize that God is speaking in this time and that we had better listen. The politicians wave the Bible, quote the scripture. I just wish they'd sit down and read it. Right? I'm not talking about one side or the other. I'm not impressed by any of them at this moment. Right? I wish they'd give me a crack at it. Right? Here's what I tell you to do. You take care of the women and the children and the infirm. You make sure the old are cared for. Make sure folks have what they need. Serve one another. Be good to one another. Love one another. Share what you have. But then that's another kind of kingdom. And I find my place in the pulpit. I want to ask, are we listening? And where do we go with all this anxiety? Where do we take all this fear? And how do we hear God speaking in these unprecedented times? I'm reminded these aren't the first unprecedented times that have ever been. Right? I mean, we have our grandparents or our parents who lived through the wars. My grandmother lived through the war and the Spanish flu, right? And we've had incredible times of fear and oppression and scarcity, even in this nation. A few years ago, in other parts of the world, of course, this is something that is lived through on the regular. But I mean, we can look through the epochs of time and think about history and when crazy things happen and people were just left dumbfounded at the catastrophe. I'm trying to say catastrophe, and that's the accent on the wrong word. So I think about how a couple years ago I was in Pompeii in Italy. And that in the late 70s AD, there was this Mount Vesuvius erupted. And people were just living their lives. They were sitting in services of worship. They were getting the wash basin out. They were playing with dogs in their backyards. And this lava and ash rained down on them. And today, you can go and see these bodies, these shapes of people that they've lifted from the ash after centuries. And you can see the shape of the little puppy and the little boy playing with him because it's preserved under all that hot rock and ash that came crashing down. Unprecedented things have happened before. They will happen again. So as I look to what the lectionary offered for us today, I was not happy to find the story of Genesis 22 and the sacrifice of Isaac. I mean, is there a harder story in the whole entire text? And is there a story that's maybe been more misappropriated or misunderstood? Is there one that's harder to reconcile than the notion of God calling us to sacrifice the gift that God has given to us? Well, remember with me, if you can, this story. One of the things I find interesting about the text in Genesis 22 is that it starts out this way: after all these things. This isn't Abraham's first rodeo with God and some sort of crazy call, right? If you remember in Genesis 12, this is how it all begins. God calls out to Abram at that time, says, leave your family, leave your inheritance, leave the people you know, leave where you live, and set out on a journey. And when you get there, I'll let you know. God's promised Abraham children and descendants, and there's been all these failed attempts. There's the tryst with Hagar, and he has the child Ishmael, and he thinks that's going to be the answer to the promise. But no, God says no, and God tells him, send them away. And so Abraham has to watch as his precious oldest son leaves with Hagar and gives them a jar of water and bread to go out into the wilderness, having no idea what will happen to them. Sarah's now had a child, and that child is grown up to be beautiful and lovely and precious in their eyes. And God has said Ishmael is not the child of the promise. It is Isaac. And then after all these things, God calls out and says, take your gift, your baby, your hope, the promise. Take Isaac and sacrifice him. Go to the land of Moriah, to one of the mountains, and when you get there, I'll tell you. Sacrifice him to me. And we're not told about the struggle that Abraham had internally, but I feel like we got to sit with that just a minute. One of the questions I've always had is, what did Abraham think he was going to tell Sarah when he came off that mountain without her baby? Right? Let me tell you what kind of hot water Kevin Majeski is in when mine comes home with a skint up knee. Right? How did he struggle? Did he put it off for days? How did he get up the mountain knowing this was what was ahead of him? In the scripture, this is called in the Hebrew the Akedah, right? The sacrifice. And it's hard for us to understand in our context. We don't have sacrifices. We don't sacrifice animals. We're not a part of that sort of story in this day and time. And so oftentimes what we'll do is we'll equate it of what if we have idols and we have to sacrifice those to God. But I want you to think about this with me a little differently today. I want you to think about it with me in terms of who God is and where God is in this story. I've told you that I've been at home with Max, and we've had the experience of e-learning, which makes even very educated people feel dumb. I've been working the entire time. I've had classes, and somehow the good plan, the right thing to do was to bring our children home while Mommy and Daddy worked and let them be educated over the internets, and we would all just be able to be productive in that kind of setup. My home looks like a playground. When the weather was so bad and we couldn't get outside, I nearly lost it all. I would tell people, they'd say, "How are you doing?" I'd say, "Well, if the sun is shining and we can go for a walk, we're okay. If it's not, it's really bad here. Because there are footballs flying across your head. There are basketball shots being made across the room. We are jumping and bouncing from one side to the other, and Mommy is trying to grade an exam." But we also built forts. And we also laid out in the sunshine under blankets. And we looked for four-leaf clovers. And we went on nature hikes, trying to find something that started with every letter of the alphabet. And I thought to myself, I will never get this time back. So I better use it. And I come to this text, and I can't help but think about my baby. And those big eyes, those big molten pools of color the shade of Tennessee whiskey. I call him Butter because butter is the best thing I can think of. And now I'm only allowed to say it once in the morning and once at night because he's a big kid. But he is so precious to me. He is the king of knock-knock jokes. He never wants to go to bed on time. He hides our things just for sport. Right? And his best day is when we can't find our cell phone or our shoes or our wallet. And the thought of anything harming him or of a God who'd ask me to. So what if the point of this story is not about sacrifice? What if it's a lesson about who God is? What if God is saying to the Father of nations, to the one who is the conduit of the promise, lots of things are going to threaten this boy. Lots of things are going to get in the way of the fulfillment of this promise. Many terrible things will come to pass. Life will try to wipe this away, all that I have given to you. But I am here. Never forget that. That I am the one who gave you this hope, this promise. And I will see it through. Maybe this is God reminding us, I am the one who will show you the way through the pain. I am the one who will lead you through the fear. I will steady you as you climb that mountain. I will direct you and your hands toward goodness. I will provide. Stop, Abraham. This is not who I am. When I was in seminary, we were given this text, and we had to kind of problematize it or figure out what we thought it was about. I went to my mentor, Jeanette Flynn. I remember saying to her, "You've got to help me. I don't know what to do about a God who would call this, about a God who would instruct this kind of pain on a child. I can't figure this out." She said, "You can. Go back to the text and then talk to me when you get there." I stayed up late nights. I dug it out. I searched the Hebrew. I did the research, and I would even have dreams that I was confronting these Hebrew ideas and some of these old Palestinian gods. You don't need to go there. Let me just skip all that for you. Nobody else has to have dreams of Chemosh or Molech. Let me just fast forward, right? You see, in this time, in the time of Abraham, child sacrifice to deity was just a common practice. Think for a moment, if you will, about the Iliad or the story of Troy, right? Think about the stories of history in the ancients. Child sacrifice was a way of demonstrating your devotion. And even in Scripture, the prophets, prompted by God, will mimic, they will taunt the gods who will, of Cana, who will demand child sacrifice. God is in this story saying, that's not who I am. I am different. I am the God who raises your child up off the altar and removes the knife from his neck. I am a different kind of God. I have a different kind of law, and my way is different. I am with you. I am for you. And I'm not here to take your babies. Do you understand? That's exactly what distinguished Yahweh of the Old Testament from all the other gods in Cana of that time. And this is the telling of that story, of that characteristic. I want to ask you this morning, or have these days left you? Have you lost someone that you love to this virus? Have you lost employment or financial security? Have you lost some false sense of security that you had before this time of fear? Are you afraid for the safety of your child on his drive home from a friend's house? Do you feel the cold steel of the knife on your neck? I haven't seen my father since December. He's 83 years old, and we thought it best to stay away. So he's been in his house. We've been keeping him safe, no visitors all through the winter. And first week of May, he fell and broke his leg. And so this person who has stayed indoors and stayed away from family, not seen his grandchildren, had to go to the hospital, right? Where the virus lives. And the anxiety of that just tore me up. Here's what's worse, I couldn't see him. There's no way to go, there's no way to help, there's no waiting room to sit in. People have just been visiting their loved ones on the deathbed, on the grainy images of iPads to say goodbye to their beloved. That's what's happened to us in this time. We've gotten itchy and we've gotten afraid, and our fear has taken over, and our fear in so many ways has brought out the worst in us instead of the faith in us. We've been emissaries to the fear, to the hate, and not to the love and to the hope. We forgot to take care of each other. That was the most important thing. My dad went to the hospital, and then after the hospital, he went to rehab, and then after rehab, he went to the high-skilled nursing home, and every single step was just closer and closer and closer to the threat, and nothing we could do. Happy to tell you he's home now, and he says that he's walking better than ever and able to chase my stepmother around the house. So we're good. But it could have gone another way. And the fear of that, which so many of you know, was so heavy. Moriah, did you know, is that place where the Jewish temple was built. It's now where the Dome of the Rock stands. It is understood by three world religious traditions as holy, right? For the Muslims, the Jews, and Christians. It's holy because this is the place where God proved God's self to Abraham. Did you catch that? It's not so much that Abraham proved himself to God. He did that too. But God proved God's self to Abraham. This is the God who stood before Abraham, is what it says in the Hebrew, and said, this is what's going to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah. And do you remember, Abraham will barter with God. But if you can find some holy people there, will you withhold? God, yes, Abraham. If you can find holy people there. This relationship that we miss when we read these stories. God cared what Abraham thought. He cared about Abraham's heart. He cared about what Abraham did. God chose to come through Abraham to raise up Isaac and to breathe the promise, the hope into existence. It's all connected, right? God is saying, I don't abuse children. I do not claim victims. I am here for Isaac. Isaac is the plan. His frail and his helpless body, he will be the way through. Don't snuff out his life. Listen to his life. This one without any power in this moment. He is the way of hope. So I want us to think long and hard this morning about this text and about what it asks. About who are the powerless voices in our lives. About who are the lives we are listening to. Who are the oppressed in our moment? Who are the Isaacs? Who are the victims? Who are the defenseless who are speaking to us, whom we need to hear? And are we listening? Don't snuff out those voices, for the promise of God is in them. We read text and we exegete text in our own times. So as I studied this text this week, I couldn't get the image of black mothers out of my mind, afraid for their lives of their children. I thought about my dear friend Mary and how fearful she was just a few weeks ago when her precious son Stephen got pulled over in the middle of the night, and she didn't know how it would go. I think about my friends in Syria. I think about Syrian mothers rocking babies in refugee camps, in tents on the border. I think about my friend Violet, about my friend Rashid, about all the people that I met there when that was this beautiful country filled with opulence and education and food and drink and parties. About the churches I visited, alive with young people who were on fire for Jesus. And how they sit out in the cold, awaiting the answer of God. I think about women I know who are holding their children close. My friends at Strip Love who pray that their children will never know the abuses that they've had to endure. Crying out. Crying out. Listen to the voices of these precious ones. The one whom God loves. The ones with the knife on their necks. Because, my friends, God is on their side. Genesis to Revelation, God is on their sides. God is calling and has always called God's people to be for and with them. The promise of God is kept in these bodies. And blessed are we when we listen, when we protect, when we remember what is true about God and God's plan. God, who raised Isaac up off that altar. The promise who stumbled up from that traumatic hour and wiped his tears and went home to live another day. How he'd go unharmed and choose for himself a wife from his father's people. How they would have twin boys. And they'd fight between each other. Eventually things would turn out okay. And that one of those boys would have 12 sons and one daughter. And that they would grow and they would have children and they would learn about God. And they would raise their babies in the way of God. And they would become a people, Israel. Which means the one who struggles with God. We never said this was easy. And through God's people, the plan was that God would bless the whole world. Don't miss that step in the covenant, right? I will give you as many descendants as there are stars in the sea. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. And through you, I will bless all the people of the earth. That promise, that covenant was always for everybody. They were just the way of it. They were the way that it came through to the world. And through God's people, the plan was that the whole world would know the love of God. Because these people, the people of the promise, were to keep God's ways, to love the widows and the orphans, the aliens and the poor. And it was not until they forgot that, when they refused to forgive debts, to set slaves free, to return land to its original owner. It wasn't until they failed to observe the Jubilee that God sent another baby. That in his 30th year would stand up in the synagogue at Nazareth and say, "In me the Jubilee has come. Slaves will be set free, debts will be forgiven, land will be returned, and everybody has a chance because I have come." It wasn't until they forgot that Christ came into the world to remind us again. If you are anxious, look for the helpers. If you're in fear, look for God in the helpless. If you're in need of hope, remember God is on the side of victims. And if it is in your power, lift the knife off the neck of God's own, and you will be blessed. Romans 4 is this gorgeous passage. And Paul was doing in his time what I'm doing in mine. He was exegeting the text for his people. And what he said was, let me tell you how Abraham got up that hill. He said, against all hope, in hope, Abraham believed. Because this wasn't the first thing Abraham had seen God do that was tremendous. Abraham knew God to be the God who called dead things back to life again. Abraham knew that God was a God who called things that were not into being. And so Abraham trusted that God. Even in the valley of the confusion and climbing that hill to Moriah. because Abraham had seen what God could do. Abraham knew there was nothing so dead God could not raise it. There is nothing so broken as God cannot heal it. There is nothing so lost God cannot save it. There is nothing so torn asunder that God cannot make it whole. May it be with us, just as it was with Abraham and Isaac. Amen.